everyone, to the town hall on big tech's digital trade attack on working people and labor rights. I am Lori Wallach with the American Economic Liberties Project's Rethink Trade, and I'm very excited to welcome you today to a live town hall featuring the General President of the Teamsters Union, Sean O'Brien, Congressman Ro Khanna, and a message from Senator Sherrod Brown. All amazing leaders fighting for working people at home and in the global economy. I'm going to start out by setting a bit of the context and announcing the publication of Rethink Trade's first briefing paper in a series on digital trade. And here's the spoiler. It's not really about trade. It is going to affect everyone's lives, however, so stay tuned, and so glad to welcome all the 1,000 people who are watching live streaming. Thank you very much for folks in the social platforms. Very glad to have you here joining everyone who's on Zoom. So the evolution of the internet, development of artificial intelligence, the growth of the data economy, they're all transforming every aspect of our lives. And in some ways, for the good. But unchecked and unregulated use of digital technologies also has proved harmful in many, many ways. In the United States and around the world, governments are cracking down on big tech's ability to abuse workers, abuse consumers, abuse their competing businesses. Yet we're all trying to seize the benefits of the digital economy. So in response to these efforts to finally end the wild, wild west of no rules, the big tech corporations are relentlessly fighting back. And public opinion has decidedly shifted against them. So they have shifted to a backdoor strategy that they have branded digital trade, where they are attempting to hijack international negotiations, labeled as trade negotiations, and impose binding international rules that effectively handcuff governments. First slide, Taylor, please. So that the governments cannot actually implement rules that can limit the digital firms' powers and or make them follow things like the basic labor laws. Specifically, the firms are hoping to have binding digital trade agreements that would undermine U.S. Congress and U.S. agencies' abilities to make these new digital governance rules and to export that model worldwide. Now, President Biden said his trade deals are going to be based on a new worker-centered model, and we are for that. But the big tech interests really would love to have these agreements instead impose a lot of rules that actually could be very detrimental to working people and to labor rights. And so it is in this context that we hope you will read the briefing paper we've put out and understand how this works, which just in sum, if you're thinking, how the heck can a trade agreement do this? All trade agreements have a provision like what's in the peach box. Countries are required to make all of their domestic laws follow these trade agreement rules. Next slide, please. So, although these agreements have nothing to do with trade, they will directly affect people's employment security, their wages, the quality of their workplaces. So in comments, in the context of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework and other trade negotiations, the big tech interests have been very clear what they want, and what they want provides no value to workers, to consumers, to other businesses. There are no fixes for the real problems. Instead, it's trying to export the US model of not overseeing big tech abuses. Next slide, please. So how exactly are these rules going to work? So these are rules, so you don't think I'm just making this up, that ended up in either the revised NAFTA, the USMCA, or in the TPP. So one common rule is tech firms get extreme secrecy protections for their code and algorithm. What does that mean? That means all the forms of bossware that basically undermine workers' rights, can break wage and hour rules, discriminate in hiring and promotion practices, snoop on workers and figure out who's trying to organize a union. in order for, say, the Department of Labor to enforce the existing laws, much less if there's ever a workers' AI Bill of Rights, obviously the government's going to need to be able to review and oversee whether these behaviors are going on, not under these digital trade rules if big tech gets its way. Another common standard is an absolute guarantee of free flow of information with no limits on where it's stored or where it's processed. Now, obviously, it doesn't take a trade lawyer to know that means if the data goes, the work goes. So it promotes digital offshoring. And in a moment of honesty, someone from Facebook actually said, if transferring personal data were not permitting, offshoring business services to popular offshoring destinations would no longer be possible. This also, the free flow of data, means any kind of data that you have a right to be forgotten about. For instance, your health information that your company collects. If it goes offshore, there's no guarantee it ever goes away, even if you have a right to be forgotten on paper. Then there's a standard, which I'm going to get into more, the no discrimination standard, which basically undermines general application, labor, consumer, and other laws. And there's unfortunately already some cases involving Uber to show how that could work. And then the platform liability waiver, basically exporting something called Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. It basically is like a free pass for online platforms. It's very controversial. Should it stay? Should it be amended? Should it be changed? This would lock it in forever. Next slide, please. Now, I'm just going to quickly touch on two of the ways in which these rules work, and then we're going to hear from our speakers. So the non-discrimination obligation and the misclassification of gig workers. The digital trade frame basically reinforces what I think of as the original sin of the digital economy. Huge firms in communications, transportation, retail, they pretend they're different than their competitors of the brick and mortar form. They pretend they're communications firms only, and they avoid regulations that apply. So that means their workers, instead of being seen as a potential bargaining unit, employees of these big firms get treated as contractors with the sanitized name of gig worker. But it's a long time evade labor law standard. And the non-discrimination rule means that big tech companies basically that are big get to claim that they're treated differently because a rule has a bigger impact on them. And unfortunately, one of the cases already that's happened is with respect to the Philippines, where Uber has set a rule that simply makes Uber meet the rules about hours of service a driver can have, and that has rules about how many drivers can be on a shift to keep prices and demand up, that those are a violation because it impacts Uber more. Why does it impact Uber more? Because Uber's bigger. Next slide. Not because there's anything that's actually a legal trade barrier about that law. Same thing with the source code secrecy. If you look at laws that are being proposed, including the American Data Protection and Privacy Act, the White House, if you look at what's in the White House Bill of Rights on AI released yesterday, all of it is about having the government keep an eye on AI, on code, on algorithms, not allowed if these rules were to go into effect. Thank you. You can take down the slides. So in our paper, we go into more detail on all of this, but the people who actually are the lived leaders of this are presidents, say, of unions. And so we're incredibly honored today to have the Teamsters General President, Sean M. O'Brien. He represents 1.2 million hardworking Teamsters in the United States, Canada, and Puerto Rico. From the front lines of the labor movement, President O'Brien will discuss the security and leverage of a union contract and the power of worker solidarity, plus the imperative for all working people to rise up in the global fight against corporate greed. The Teamsters proudly protect 340,000 employees at UPS, and they recently launched a new division to organize and win better wages and working conditions for Amazon logistics and warehouse workers. It's my honor to introduce President O'Brien.
Thank you very much, Lauren. I appreciate this opportunity. It's an honor and privilege to be here today. I think, we've just gone through one of the toughest challenges we've ever seen in the U.S., and that's been the pandemic. And the one thing that I'm most proud of, especially being the Teamster leader, is that our members that went to work every single day We're considered essential workers, and we're also hailed as heroes at one point. But the true benefactors of a bad situation always seems to be big tech, big corporations that are trying to control global economies nationwide. And if we are not recognizing the success of these big tech firms and the responsibility that we have to create policies, procedure, not just in the United States, but also on a global front. And we need to have policies that have strict enforcement and penalties so that we can protect, preserve, and improve working conditions, not only for people in the States, but on a global level. Look, we are the best nation in the world as I see it, and we should be setting the policies and holding big tech like Amazon or anybody else accountable. But more importantly, we should be protecting jobs and setting the example. Too often, these big tech companies, because of some of our lax policies and procedures, and our affiliates and our partners overseas who have stronger labor laws, who have stronger protections, you get these corporations that make a mockery of the United States and try and enforce some of our weaknesses on their trade agreements, but on their workers as well. So I think we have an obligation to keep big business, big tech away from dictating policies, procedures, whether it pertains to trade or whether it pertains to any digital hijacking and or trying to hold people hostage digitally. We need to make sure there's strict penalties. And look, the Teamsters are committed on behalf of our 1.2 million members, but also affiliated with major trade unions in Europe and around the world, that we will do whatever we need to do to help keep big tech and big business out. You mentioned earlier that we have a big fight coming on with one of our largest employer. It is also e-commerce delivery company, but it has emerged, like Amazon and every other company, as a big tech dependent company that we need to fight back with. It's going to be the biggest battle that we will see, and it will be a template on how we deal with big tech moving forward, and that is our negotiations commencing in 2023 with the United Postal Service. So look, I'm very excited to be a part of this great dialogue, but more importantly, it's an honor and privilege to represent 1.2 million members. And I get the best job in the world. I get to fight corporate America and hold politicians accountable. So with that, I appreciate this opportunity.
Thank you very much, President O'Brien. I heard you in recent Senate testimony call Amazon a white-collar criminal syndicate, which I thought was genius. So I suspect my description of big tech interests trying to Trojan horse their way through in a trade agreement probably doesn't shock you, because you are clearly aware of those kind of tactics. I am wondering, in your view, what are the principles that workers care about for having a government and trade policies that work for them, given the big tech agenda is obviously about evading accountability and oversight or fairness? What's the worker, as a guy in the middle of it, what is the worker basically principles for what's good for working people?
Well, look, I think, my description of Amazon and big tech as white-collar crime syndicates, I'm very proud that we were able to label them as such, because, what they've done over the last several years, some in several decades, they have, you have companies like Amazon, you have companies like Tesla, you have companies with billionaires running these companies with total disregard for the people that make them a true success. And when you have, I think the one great thing about being an American is that we have the right to vote. We have the right to designate lawmakers who are going to develop policy and procedure. And we need to make sure we protect and support the people who actually are supposed to be making policy and procedure. And those are the people we elect. we shouldn't, or these folks like Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos or anybody else out there, they should not be dictating a global economy and global policies and procedures that are going to have a direct impact and a negative impact on working people, not only in America, but also on a global platform. And, the beauty about what we've went through recently as a pandemic is that working people actually showed their value on how important we are to providing goods and services to keep our great nation running and the global economy. And we want to be rewarded as such. And that's the beauty of having the ability to organize and form unions. But again, I just want to focus back on, we can have the best policies, the best procedures, the best trade agreements, but if we don't have strict enforcement and strict penalties, not only just monetarily, but also consequences, then regardless of how strong these policies and procedures are, then we're going to fail miserably. We can't allow big tech to find loopholes to hold people hostage, whether it's in the United States or any other global economy or global country. We've got to make sure that we keep them out of the process and we act truly as the conscience of big tech moving forward.
Beautifully said, President O'Brien, General President O'Brien of the mighty, mighty Teamsters. Thank you, and stand by for a second while I bring in Congressman Ro Khanna. Congressman Khanna represents California's 17th district, which includes Silicon Valley. He's the author of a relatively new book called Dignity in a Digital Age, and I think he has another more new one coming out. He presents in these books a vision for how democratizing digital innovation can build economic vibrancy and inclusive communities instead of letting big tech just call the shots on us and control our economy and workspaces and economic futures. Congressman Khanna has worked to try and ensure that trade policy works for working people and does not undermine government's ability to deliver for working people, while, of course, harvesting the benefits of the digital economy and expanded trade. Congressman Khanna, please.
Well, thank you, Lori. Thank you for your leadership. It's an honor to follow President O'Brien. Let me just say a few general points. The mistake we made in this country was shipping off our production and giving too much deference to corporate greed that chased cheap labor, that chased a lack of climate standards. We basically offshored production in this country for 50 years, hollowed out companies, gave free rein often to private equity that bankrupted companies. In the process, we've destroyed community. And this has been part of the cause of polarization. What we don't want to do is make that mistake going forward in the 21st century with digital technology. We don't want digital firms to be able to go forum shopping around the world for the lowest labor standards. We don't want them to go forum shopping around the world for the lowest privacy standards. We don't want them to go forum shopping around the world for the lowest standards when it comes to antitrust enforcement. And so all we're saying is let's learn the mistakes of being too differential to a free market absolutism that has left us in a situation of lack of factories, lack of jobs, destroyed communities, and not replicate that when it comes to the digital economy. And President O'Brien is absolutely right that we have to focus not just on making sure there are no loopholes in these trade agreements, but also on enforcement. And I share this with my European friends all the time. I said the tech companies are running circles around you. You may not realize it, but they're going to the lowest enforcement place. They've got dark patterns that are running circles around your regulators. And the reality is, unless America gets in the game of having strong enforcement and having strong regulatory bodies, it's not enough. The tech companies are stronger than a lot of the European regulators. And you can't innovate in policy without innovating in technology because the technologists will run circles around the policy regulators. So that is why it's so important that we not give back doors, but it's also so important that we pass legislation in the United States on privacy, on antitrust, and we strengthen the FTC, the FCC, the enforcement agencies of our government. We did that with passing, in a very small way, funding for the DOJ antitrust department just last week. We need to continue to strengthen our enforcement agencies.
Like usual, spot on with putting together all of these pieces of the problem. And I have a slightly delicate question, which you can answer as sensitively as possible, which is, you've just laid out the exact scenario where you have members of Congress and regulators who are realizing we've got a problem. They're scrambling finally to try and do something about it. We're definitely many steps behind Europe, and it is being outfoxed by the big tech guys. And the question is, do you think most members of Congress are really aware of this backdoor digital trade sneak attack, that basically they're on the front writing pieces of legislation that specifically would be undermined and forbidden if this big tech version of digital trade got into an agreement like the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework? Do you think members realize that's going on, this sort of Trojan horse attack?
Well, Lori, even I didn't realize the extent of it until I talked to you. And so I think this is why your work and the work of people on this call is so important. And it's important that we realize that these aren't just tech issues. These, people sometimes their eyes gloss over if it's abstract conversations on privacy and antitrust. This is about, do you think workers should be treated as employees with the right to unionize, or should they be treated as independent contractors? One of the points I make in Silicon Valley all the time is you can innovate with an app, but it's not innovation if what your business model is the exploitation of employees and labor. That's not innovation. The app may be innovative, but anyone can come up with a business model that is exploitive. That you don't lump that into innovation. And so we have to realize that stakes in some of these trade agreements are just like the mistakes that were made in previous trade agreements, that if you put in and lock in standards that aren't supportive of worker rights, that aren't supportive of a worker privacy, that allows the monitoring of workers, then that's a big problem. I often joke that the only thing worse than having a human boss is having an algorithmic boss. And that's the case with a lot of people on the Amazon factory warehouse. And so we have to focus on how we empower workers in this digital age. And the last point I want to make on this is, look, if think about it from a worker's perspective at Amazon. In one sense, you sort of are working in one of the richest companies in the history of humanity. You would think I got a job there, at least I could go have the American dream. And it is outrageous that with the exceeding amount of profits and profitability of companies like that we can't give workers dignity, that we can't give them a basic, a fair, livable wage. And that's what's at stake in these trade agreements.
That is exactly the case, and appreciate both of your help in helping get the word out with all the people who are with us live, and we'll see this as a recording. And another great champion for working people in the global economy has been Senator Sherrod Brown, and we're very honored to have with us today his economic policy advisor, Dr. Carolina Ferrarosa Young. She's going to read a statement from the senator who has been a leading voice in the trade debate, but broadly in the labor rights and working people's fight since the early 1990s when he first got to the House. He's now a senator. And, it's not a surprise that he is paying close attention to the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework negotiations and the digital trade terms. He is unable to join us today, but we're going to hear from him just the same. Carolina, please.
Thank you so much, Lori, and thank you so much for that introduction of the senator's work. I know he really wanted to be here, so I will go ahead and start reading his statement now. So I first want to thank Rethink Trade Director Lori Wallach for her leadership. For over a quarter of a century, Lori has been leading the charge against bad corporate trade policy that sells out workers. For too many of those years, politicians in both parties wouldn't listen. From NAFTA to PNTR to TPP, the corporate crowd and their allies wrote off entire industries and communities, all in the name of outsourcing production overseas to lower labor costs. Thanks in part to Lori's work and the labor movement shining a spotlight on these issues, I voted against every trade deal until the USMCA's historic labor enforcement provisions were drafted. We are finally starting to see some of those fights pay off in more widespread recognition of what trade policy in this country has done for our own economy and our own security. But the work is not over. We know that corporations will continue to exploit loopholes and craft the rules in their favor. That's why town halls like this one, where leaders like General President Sean O'Brien and Representative Khanna examine the potential unintended consequences of digital trade provisions, are so critical. We must put workers at the center of our economy, and that includes trade policy. Only by doing this can we ensure that hard work pays off for all workers. We know that corporations like Uber and Lyft try to get around domestic labor laws by misclassifying workers as independent contractors. If digital trade provisions are poorly crafted, it could become a mechanism by which companies creating jobs of the future can avoid local domestic labor laws, not just here, but around the world. We need greater transparency in trade agreements. I urge everyone present to remain vigilant and continue to push for lifting labor standards in all current and future trade agreements. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Carolina. And of course, always many thanks to Sherrod Brown for his leadership. I think it's worth noting Carolina herself is doing amazing things with her economics PhD from the same place where another social and economic justice leader, Joe Stiglitz, is based, Columbia University. So I would like very much now to ask a common question to President O'Brien and to Congressman Khanna, which is, so the administration has launched this IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework Agreement. 13 other countries, if there's a deal that comes out of these talks, it will cover 40% of the world's economy. And a central part of the talks are supposed to be digital trade rules. We know what the big tech guys want to do, use their monopoly power and their lobbyists to try and rig the rules. What do you think, and we all want it to be the first worker-centered trade agreement, following what the promise President Biden's made for a different kind of trade agreements. He's seen how the bad ones have played out. So in your guys' view, what are the principles for a worker-centered trade agreement? And what do you think can be done to make sure that that vision, rather than the big tech hijack vision, is what ends up in the IPEF? And whomever would like to go first, I will let you pick your pain.
I guess I'll go first. Again, I want to thank Senator Brown and also U.S. Representative Khanna for their hard work and diligence in protecting working people in America and supporting truly who actually drives this country, and that's working people. Look, I think, and I want to applaud the administration, the Biden administration, for actually thinking about protecting workers in all these trade agreements, especially the first one up. And I agree with Senator Brown that transparency is a must. And I know in different situations working with the administration, they've been more than transparent in making sure that workers' rights are protected. But I think it's simple. Look, we've got to keep big tech out of any of the decision making. We've got to be a conscience to big tech once these trade agreements are implemented. And again, I don't want to sound repetitive, but there has to be checks and balances. There has to be strict enforcement and strict penalties. And I think part of the problem sometimes, and I've experienced it recently testified at a Senate Budget Committee hearing when I did refer to Amazon as a white-collar crime syndicate, is that often two times a lot of our policymakers and lawmakers fall in love with these big tech companies who promise the world and the communities we represent, but what they're actually doing is preying on the weak. they are focusing on distressed communities. Amazon, for instance, has a 150% turnover ratio of part-time workers. They exploit an independent contractor model that doesn't allow a pathway from a part-time job to a full-time middle-class career. And if we're not enforcing these trade policies and enforcing and strengthening labor law in America, then all this bad behavior will continue to be rewarded and exploited in a global economy and a global world. So we've got to make sure that our own house is in order, and I don't mean houses and House of Representatives, but I mean our own house in America, that we are focused on enforcing policies and procedures and not having a race to the bottom globally where it's going to affect workers nationwide. And most importantly is, we sometimes get mesmerized with wealth and power. And that wealth and power is all well and good. But when it's destroying good, hardworking communities and not restoring a strong middle class, then all that wealth and power isn't going to help the people that actually built this country and will continue to help build a global world that is going to be supporting workers and unions on a global platform.
That's a very good perspective and helpful perspective. And it brings to mind the notion that with these negotiations, it's as if the big tech companies are in a race to try and lock in these bad rules through the back door of the trade agreements before the kind of domestic policies you've just described to put a leash on the big tech abuses can be enacted fully. And it's a way to undermine that agenda that you're describing we need domestically by using the rules internationally to undermine the U.S. doing the right thing and to roll back the countries that have started to do so. Congressman Khanna, may I ask you to add?
Well, I think President O'Brien is very eloquent and exactly right about the damage that has been done to so many communities, hollowed out the damage to working families and the need to rethink trade. I don't understand why we keep doing the same framework on trade. Here's what our trade policy needs to be. We've had structural trade deficits in this country since 1975. Last time we had a trade surplus was 1975. We've got a 300 plus billion trade deficit with China. Our trade policy should be that we want to have a trade surplus again, that we want to reduce the China trade deficit to zero. And every trade agreement or trade decision we make should be with that framework. Nothing else should matter. We should be first focused on how we get new factories here, new industry here, how we stop the dumping here, how we reduce the Chinese trade deficit 10% every year, and how do we get to a trade surplus. Instead, we get the same folks coming up with all these frameworks, and our trade deficits keep going up. It does nothing for Main Street. It does nothing for jobs, and it's led to the polarization in this country. So I would like the Democrats to start to be very clear. We're the party that's going to get us a trade surplus again, and every trade agreement ought to be evaluated from that perspective. In fact, we ought to be starting with those priorities for what trade agreements we enter.
Thank you very much.
Realistic. You go to Ohio or Pennsylvania, you start to have an Indo-Pacific Framework. They're like, where are my jobs? I was out there campaigning for John Fetterman in Pennsylvania. I got into a taxi cab. The taxi cab driver said, you guys in Washington sold my father's steel mill job to China. We got to get real in this country to understand why people are angry. And the Democrats need to, instead of talking about all these frameworks, need to start talking about how we're going to bring jobs back, how we're going to start lowering trade deficits, and how we're going to start talking about trade in a way that connects with people in actual voting communities.
Spot on, Congressman Khanna. And folks, if you have a question, we're going to have time for one or two questions. Go into the Q&A and fill out any questions that you have. And I want to sort of underscore the point that what we see right now is a battle between this administration is, I think, Congressman Khanna, thinking about what you just said. That's the idea underlining the worker-centered trade agenda. It's chucking out the old model and getting one that works for working people. And at the same time, there is a lot of very powerful special interests led by the big tech guys who are very keen to double down on the old failed model and junk it up even more with these big tech rules. So it's really a battle about who's going to call the shots. Are we going to see another trade agreement rigged the same way Big Pharma rigged past trade agreements to put into a free trade agreement, monopolies protecting their profits for selling medicines at an unreasonable price. So that's the battle that's been drawn. And with the folks that we've got on both sides of this fight, I myself am happy to bet on the side that has Congressman Khanna and President O'Brien and the mighty Teamsters as part of the fight on our side. One of the questions that is come up from a couple of the different folks is, what policies do you think can actually be taken to both focus on U.S. workers and discourage outsourcing and offshoring? So what are specific policies that can be taken to do that? And of course, Carolina Ferrarosa Young, if you'd like to jump in on behalf of Senator Brown, you're also welcome. And I think that is a question a bunch of people asked. I'm going to just leave it with that as summarizing it.
Maybe I can take a crack at it, and then I will have to jump off, but I just want to thank again President O'Brien for his incredible leadership on behalf of over 1 million Teamsters. And Lori, you've just been in the trenches on this. And Senator Brown, no one has done more than Senator Brown on issues of trade over the past couple of decades. And, you know, his voice now is something that everyone else recognizes. I would just say a couple simple things. I mean, every time the Democrats run on an offshoring tax, I think President Biden also ran on it. Let's get it passed. I mean, why don't we have a tax on people who want to have destroy communities and move jobs offshore? Because it's not just jobs, it's a destruction in communities. An economist would call it the negative externalities, where they totally destroy a community and aren't taking responsibility for it. So let's have a tax on that. Let's make sure that we are providing purchase agreements and financing in critical industries. I mean, we just, let me end with this point. We have to understand what we did in this country. We used to make 20% of the world's steel. We make 5%. China makes 63%. We used to make 37% of the aluminum. We make 2%. China makes 60%. We used to make a lot of the world's paper. We now make 17%. China is leading there. These were deliberate policy choices made out of a mistaken view that production didn't matter and we could just defer to corporations. We need to fix all of that, change the 50 years of policy, and start listening more to, frankly, the labor leaders who are more in touch with the communities if we want to start to bring this country together. And Lori, I appreciate your leadership on all of these issues.
Thank you very much, Congressman Khanna, and thank you for joining us. Anyone else?
Lori, if I could just respond to that, and I am 100% on board with U.S. Representative Khanna and what he had to say. You look at I'll give you an example. You look at Carrier air conditioning units. Every big building in the United States was once serviced by Carrier, a company that was based in Syracuse, New York, that employed almost 8,000 people. One stroke of a pen, one bad trade deal focused on a bottom line of a balance sheet instead of the actual negative impact it would have on our community and families, is one of the perfect examples. The other thing, too, is we all hear about all these supply chain solution problems. And the Congress makes a great point of what used to happen in the past and what's happening now. Had we protected American jobs, had we protected manufacturing jobs in the United States, we may not have this supply chain solution that we're currently experiencing right now. And, you know, I want to commend the Biden administration for passing the CHIPS Act and everything else, where we're going to manufacture chips throughout the United States with all good paying union manufacturing jobs. So if we take a look back at the bad decisions we've made in the past and focus on what needs to happen in the future, I think we can be a global example of what it is when you enforce strict trade policies, when you hold global companies like Amazon accountable, and you embrace reinstituting a strong middle class that is not afraid to unionize. And I think most importantly, recently, there is a 71% favorable survey out there supporting unionization. And why is that? Because people are fed up with corporate America and corporate greed dictating policies and procedure, not just in the United States, but on a global platform as well.
Thank you very much, President O'Brien. I think the summary of what is the answer is to not allow the big tech companies to rig the rules and double down on the old model. So there shouldn't be special privacy for them to hide the discriminatory or other kinds of bossware. There shouldn't be special rights guarantees to transfer data as a somehow natural right. The trade agreements, basically, as our speakers have all said, should be to focus on what is good for building up our resilience, for what is good for workers, what is good for sprouting up again production capacity here. And with that in mind, I want to thank our amazing panel and for everyone who has been listening to the live. Please take a look at the briefing paper we're releasing today if you want more details about these specific issues, about the digital trade agenda of big tech's threat to working people. This is a series that starts with this. The next one is going to be on artificial intelligence, which gets into civil rights enforcement, which gets into criminal justice reform. So many different things that we are all focused on that are very important could be undermined if big tech is able to rig digital trade rules to stop the fight back against big tech's abuses. So thank you all to all three of our speakers, with enormous appreciation to Teamsters General President Sean O'Brien, Congressman Ro Khanna, Sherrod Brown, and his wonderful staffer, Carolina Young. Appreciate all of you, appreciate the audience. And with that, I'm going to close today's town hall and urge everyone to keep paying attention. This is going to be a big fight and a big debate, and everyone here today is part of the solution. Thank you very much.